I'm Christina, 35 years old, and right now I'm taping up the last cardboard box in what used to be our living room. The walls are bare, the floors echo with emptiness, and in exactly 2 hours, this house won't be mine anymore. My husband Mark is driving back from Miami today from what he called an important business trip. He texted me this morning that he's bringing some special guests who need a place to stay. I'm watching the driveway through the window, waiting, because he has no idea what he's about to walk into. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from today. Hit that subscribe button because this story will blow your mind, and trust me, you'll want to hear how a woman can rebuild her entire life in just 2 weeks. 3 weeks ago, my life looked perfect from the outside. Mark and I lived in this beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house in suburban Denver, the kind with the wraparound porch and the white picket fence that made everyone stop and admire. We'd been married for 12 years, and people often called us the power couple of our neighborhood. We chose not to have children. Both of us focused on building our careers instead. Mark worked as a senior marketing executive at one of Denver's largest tech companies, while I ran my successful online boutique that I'd built from scratch 5 years ago. This house meant everything to me. We bought it 5 years ago, and I still remember the day we signed the papers. I'd used 60% of the down payment from the inheritance my grandmother left me, nearly $200,000. Mark contributed the rest, and we split the mortgage payments. But it was more than just financial investment for me. Every room held memories of the life I thought we were building together. The kitchen, where we cooked Sunday dinners. The home office, where I grew my business. The master bedroom, where we'd lie awake, planning our future. Mark had always been ambitious, and I loved that about him. He'd work late, bring home presentations to review, and constantly talk about the next big campaign or client acquisition. His dedication had paid off with promotions and bonuses that allowed us to live comfortably. We had our routines down perfectly. Morning coffee together on the porch, gym sessions 3 times a week, date nights every Friday at different restaurants around the city. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday evening, Mark came home with unusual energy. He practically bounced through the door, his face lit up with excitement I hadn't seen in months. He pulled me into the kitchen, poured us both wine, and announced he'd been selected to lead a major presentation in Miami for a potential client that could bring millions to his company. The trip would last 10 days, he explained, and it was crucial for his career advancement. The CEO himself had chosen Mark for this opportunity. I felt proud of him, genuinely happy that his hard work was being recognized. That night we celebrated with takeout from his favorite Thai restaurant, and he spent hours telling me about the presentation strategy, the client's background, and how this could lead to a senior vice president position. I helped him pack, noticing he'd bought several new suits and an expensive cologne I'd never seen before. When I commented on the new wardrobe, he laughed and said he wanted to make the best impression possible. The night before his departure, Mark surprised me with dinner at the French restaurant where we'd had our first date. He held my hand across the table, looked into my eyes, and promised that after this trip, after he secured this deal, we'd take that European vacation we'd been postponing for years. He said he wanted to spend more quality time together, maybe even renew our vows for our 15th anniversary. I went to bed that night, feeling more in love with my husband than I had in years. The morning he left, something felt different. Mark seemed nervous, checking his phone every few minutes, adjusting his tie repeatedly. When the Uber arrived to take him to the airport, he hugged me longer than usual, kissed me twice, and told me he loved me 3 times before getting in the car. I stood on the porch, watching him leave, attributing his behavior to pre-presentation nerves. The first 3 days of his absence passed normally. Mark called every evening after his meetings, texted me good morning messages, and sent photos of the Miami Conference Center. His voice sounded tired but excited, and he kept mentioning how well the preliminary meetings were going. I fell into my own routine, easily spending longer hours on my online boutique, attending my regular yoga classes, and having dinner with my sister Lauren on the second night. Lauren and I had always been close, just 2 years apart in age. She'd been through her own divorce 3 years earlier and had emerged stronger, which I admired. Over pasta and wine, she asked how Mark and I were doing, and I told her about his big opportunity in Miami. She smiled and said she was happy for us, but something in her expression seemed cautious, like she wanted to say more but held back. I didn't think much of it at the time. My boutique was having an exceptional month, with sales up 30% from the previous year. I specialized in sustainable fashion, carefully curated pieces from independent designers who shared my values about ethical production. The business had grown from a side project to my full-time passion, and I was considering opening a physical showroom. Mark had always been supportive, at least verbally, though lately he'd seemed less interested in hearing about my expansion plans. Day 4 of Mark's trip started like any other Thursday. I woke up early, processed overnight orders, and responded to customer emails. Around noon, while reviewing our social media metrics, I had an idea. Mark's favorite band was coming to Denver next month, and I thought surprise concert tickets would be the perfect welcome home gift. But I needed to check his calendar to make sure he didn't have any conflicts. I called his office to speak with Jennifer, his executive assistant. She'd worked with Mark for 3 years, and we'd chatted at several company events. She was friendly enough, though I'd always sensed she was a bit too eager to please Mark, staying late whenever he worked overtime, bringing him coffee without being asked. When I called the main line, the receptionist told me Jennifer was out of the office on vacation. In Miami, she added before I even asked where. The coincidence struck me as odd, but Miami was a popular destination. I thanked the receptionist and hung up, deciding to check Mark's calendar myself when he got home. That evening, when Mark called, the conversation felt different. He seemed distracted, cutting our call short after just 5 minutes, claiming exhaustion from back-to-back presentations. His voice sounded strange, like he was outside rather than in his hotel room. I heard what sounded like waves in the background, maybe seagulls. But when I asked if he was at the beach, he quickly said no and changed the subject. Day 5 changed everything. My laptop, which I'd been nursing along for 2 years, finally gave up during a crucial inventory update. The screen went black, and no amount of restarting would bring it back to life. With orders to process and customers waiting, I needed a computer immediately. Mark's home office was just down the hall, his desktop computer sitting there unused. He'd given me his passwords long ago for emergencies, though I'd rarely needed to use them. I sat down at his desk, moved aside the framed photo of us from our anniversary dinner, and logged in. His email was already open, the browser remembering his credentials. I was about to open a new tab for my inventory system when a subject line in his inbox caught my eye. Flight confirmation for 5 passengers to Miami. My heart started racing before my brain could process what I was seeing. I clicked on the email from the airline. There they were, 5 names listed clearly. Mark Thompson, Jennifer Martinez, Robert Martinez, Linda Martinez, and Sophia Martinez. The booking was made 2 weeks ago, all seats together, all returning on the same flight in 5 days. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, reading the names over and over, hoping I was misunderstanding something. Jennifer was his assistant. Robert and Linda had to be her parents. Sophia, based on the child fare notation, was probably her daughter. My husband had taken his assistant and her entire family on what he'd told me was a crucial business trip. The room started spinning, but I forced myself to keep looking to understand what I was seeing. I opened his credit card account in a new tab, my fingers moving almost without my conscious control. The statements loaded slowly each month, revealing more than the last. There were dinner charges at restaurants I'd never been to, always for two people dating back 8 months. Jewelry store purchases that weren't for my birthday or our anniversary. Weekend hotel bookings in Dubbings, in Boulder and Aspen, when he'd claimed to be at conferences or working late at the office. Going back to his email, I searched for Jennifer's name. Hundreds of messages populated the screen. Most were seemingly innocent work exchanges, but scattered throughout were personal conversations that made my stomach turn. I clicked on one from 2 weeks ago, just before the Miami trip. Jennifer had written about how excited she was to finally move forward with their plans, how her parents were thrilled to meet him properly, and how Sophia couldn't wait to see her new room. Her new room. In my house. Mark's response was what broke me. He'd written about getting me to agree to a divorce, making it seem mutual to avoid complications. He mentioned that since the house mortgage was in both our names, he could claim it as marital property in the settlement. He told Jennifer not to worry, that I was reasonable and would probably want to move closer to my sister anyway. He actually wrote that Jennifer would love the garden and that Sophia would enjoy the pool. The last email in their chain, sent the day before he left, was Jennifer asking if he was sure I wouldn't find out. His response was confident, almost arrogant. He said I was too busy with my little online shop to notice anything, and that by the time they returned from Miami, they'd present it as a done deal. Jennifer would need temporary accommodation after a supposed apartment flood, and he'd gradually introduce the idea of separation over the following weeks. I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting. My whole body shook as I sat on the cold tile floor, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. 8 months. 8 months of lies, of coming home to me after being with her, of making plans for our future while planning a different one with Jennifer. I thought about all the times he'd worked late, all the weekend conferences, all the client dinners. How many were real? How many times had I kissed him after he'd been with her? I called Lauren, barely able to speak through the sobs. She was at my door in 15 minutes, holding me while I showed her everything I'd found. Her face went from shock to rage as she read through the emails. She told me she'd suspected something was off about Mark lately, but hadn't wanted to upset me without proof. Now we had more proof than anyone could need. Day 6 arrived with surprising clarity. I'd spent the night cycling between rage and devastation, but as the sun came up, something shifted. The tears stopped, replaced by a cold determination I'd never felt before. Mark thought I was too naive, too trusting, too busy with my little shop to notice his deception. He was about to learn exactly who he'd underestimated. My first call was to Diane, a divorce attorney who'd helped Lauren through her separation. Diane also happened to be a regular customer of my boutique and had become a friend over the years. When I explained the situation, she immediately cleared her morning schedule. We met at her office, and I showed her everything. The emails, the credit card statements, the flight confirmation. Diane's expression grew more serious with each piece of evidence. She explained that Colorado was an equitable distribution state, but the inheritance I'd used for the house down payment could be considered separate property if properly documented. Since I'd kept clear records of the inheritance and the house purchase, Mark's claim to the property wasn't as strong as he assumed. The emails showing his deception and financial infidelity would work in my favor during divorce proceedings. But Diane suggested I needed more concrete evidence of the affair. That's when she recommended Tom, a private investigator who specialized in infidelity cases. Tom was a former detective professional and discreet. I hired him immediately, sending him all the information about Mark and Jennifer's location in Miami. Within 6 hours, Tom had reached Miami and begun surveillance. He promised to send updates as soon as he had visual confirmation. While waiting for Tom's reports, I turned my attention to our finances. I'd always managed my business accounts separately, but our personal accounts were joint. Logging into our savings account, I discovered Mark had already moved $40,000 to his personal account over the past 3 months. $40,000 of our shared savings, probably funding his new life with Jennifer. The checking account showed regular transfers I hadn't noticed before, small amounts that added up to thousands. I started documenting everything. Every suspicious transaction, every email, every piece of evidence that showed Mark's betrayal. I created spreadsheets, backed up files, and made copies of everything. The businessman in me took over, treating this like a hostile takeover that needed to be defended against. By evening, I had a comprehensive file that would make any attorney proud. Day 7 brought the first photos from Tom. My phone buzzed during lunch, and there they were in vivid color. Mark and Jennifer on the beach at an exclusive Miami resort. Her hand on his chest, his arm around her waist. Another photo showed them at a poolside bar with her parents, Mark, laughing at something Robert was saying while Linda smiled approvingly. The third photo hit hardest. Mark in the pool with Sophia teaching her to swim, while Jennifer watched from a lounge chair like they were a perfect family. Tom's second batch of photos came that evening. These were from an upscale restaurant, the kind Mark only took me to on special occasions. He was wearing the new suit I'd helped him pack Jennifer, in a dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her parents were there too, raising champagne glasses in what looked like a celebration. The photo that made my blood boil showed Jennifer's wrist adorned with a diamond tennis bracelet I recognized from our credit card statement. $3,000 charged 2 months ago when Mark claimed he'd bought a new golf club set. The next photos were even more damaging. Tom had managed to capture Mark introducing Jennifer to what appeared to be business associates at a conference cocktail party. According to Tom's notes, Mark had introduced her as his fiancée. His fiancée. While still married to me, while I sat in our home trusting him, he was telling strangers in Miami that Jennifer was his fiancée. One photo showed Jennifer displaying her left hand to a group of women, and though the image was slightly blurry, there was definitely a ring on that finger. That night I couldn't eat. Lauren brought soup, but I couldn't manage more than a few sips. My rage had transformed into something colder, more focused. Mark hadn't just cheated. He'd created an entire alternate life, funded it with our money, and planned to take our home. The home. My grandmother's money had bought the home, where I'd built my business. The home he'd promised Jennifer and her daughter. Day 8 marked my transformation from victim to strategist. I woke up with a plan, clear and decisive. First, I called my cousin Brian, who worked in real estate investment. Brian had mentioned months ago that he had cash buyers looking for properties in our neighborhood. The market was hot, and our house, with its upgrades and prime location, would sell quickly. When I explained my situation, Brian didn't hesitate. He could have a cash buyer there by afternoon, and with the right price, we could close in a week. The buyer arrived at 3, a young tech executive relocating from California. He walked through the house with barely concealed excitement, loving everything from the renovated kitchen to the finished basement. When he saw Mark's home office, he mentioned it would be perfect for his remote work setup. I wanted to tell him it had been perfect for discovering affairs too, but I kept my composure. He offered $680,000 cash, closing in 5 days. The house was worth $700,000, but the quick cash sale was worth the small loss. We shook hands, and Brian said he'd have the paperwork ready by morning. That evening, I started my secret move. Lauren arrived with boxes and packing tape, and we began with my grandmother's china. The family photos that mattered only to me, my jewelry, and the artwork I'd collected over the years. We worked until 3 in the morning, filling box after box, labeling everything carefully. The storage unit I'd rented was climate-controlled and secure, perfect for keeping my treasures safe, while I figured out my next steps. Day 9 was a whirlwind of calculated action. Diane filed the separation papers first thing in the morning, citing irreconcilable differences and financial infidelity. With the evidence we'd gathered, she was confident we could push for a favorable settlement. The filing also included a freeze on our joint accounts after I withdrew exactly half of the remaining balance. Mark would find out soon enough that his access was limited, but by then it would be too late for him to stop the sale of the house. The cash buyer's lawyer sent over the contracts by noon, and I signed them with a steady hand. The closing was scheduled for the day after Mark's return, giving me just enough time to complete my plan. The title company confirmed that since the deed was in both our names, but the majority down payment was traceable to my inheritance, and since Mark was unreachable for consent, the emergency sale clause in our mortgage agreement could be invoked, given the evidence of financial malfeasance Diane had documented. I spent the afternoon systematically packing everything that mattered: my clothes, my office equipment, for the boutique photo albums, from before Mark, gifts from my family, and every single item I'd purchased with my own money. Lauren helped me move the boxes to the storage unit, making multiple trips in her SUV. We left Mark's things exactly where they were scattered around the house, as if frozen in time. His golf clubs in the garage, his watches on the dresser, his clothes in the closet. Let him deal with packing his own life. That evening I toured 3 apartments settling on a modern 2-bedroom in downtown Denver. It was smaller than the house but filled with natural light and had a perfect corner for my home office. The building had security, a gym, and a coffee shop on the ground floor. Most importantly, it was mine alone. I signed the lease that night, move-in date for tomorrow, the day of Mark's return. The property manager, sensing my urgency, waived the usual waiting period. Day 10 brought more revelations from Tom in Miami. His morning photos showed Mark and Jennifer at a real estate office looking at property listings. The afternoon photos captured them touring a house with Sophia and her parents, the family examining rooms and discussing something animatedly. Tom's audio recording, captured from a distance, revealed they were looking at schools for Sophia in Miami, discussing a potential relocation. But the most interesting part was Mark on the phone in the parking lot, clearly audible, talking about renovations for the Denver house. He mentioned converting my art studio into Sophia's game room and turning the garden into an entertainment space. That's when I discovered Jennifer's Pinterest board. She hadn't even tried to hide it. The board was titled New Beginning and filled with renovation ideas for what was clearly my house. She'd pinned furniture for the living room, paint colors for the master bedroom, and landscape designs that would destroy the garden I'd spent 3 years cultivating. There were even pins about blending families and being a stepmom. The delusion was complete. They'd planned every detail of their life in my home, funded by my inheritance, built on the destruction of my marriage. Day 11. Mark's last day in Miami, he finally texted about his return. His message was casual, mentioning he'd be back tomorrow afternoon and bringing some colleagues who needed temporary accommodation due to a hotel booking mix-up. He asked if I could prepare the guest rooms and maybe cook that pasta dish Jennifer had mentioned loving when she'd visited for a work dinner months ago. The audacity of asking me to cook for his mistress made my hands shake, but I responded perfectly. "Of course, darling," I wrote. "Everything will be ready for your guests." I spent that final night before his return doing the last of my preparation. The moving truck was scheduled for early morning to take my stored items to the new apartment. The house closing was at 4 in the afternoon, giving Mark just enough time to arrive and face reality. I installed small security cameras in the front hall and living room, wanting to document everything that was about to happen. Diane had suggested recording might be useful if Mark became aggressive or made threats. The cameras were tiny and visible unless you knew where to look. Lauren stayed with me that night, holding my hand as we sat in the empty house, eating takeout on the floor. We talked about everything except what would happen tomorrow. She told me stories about her own divorce, how she'd felt when she'd discovered her ex's betrayal, how long it had taken to trust again. But she also talked about the freedom she'd found, the strength she'd discovered, the life she'd built that was entirely her own. As we fell asleep on air mattresses in what used to be my bedroom, I felt ready for whatever came next. Day 12. The morning of Mark's return, I woke at dawn. The movers arrived at 7, efficiently loading everything from the storage unit into their truck. By 9, my new apartment was filling with boxes, and I was starting to feel like I could breathe again. The apartment smelled like fresh paint, and possibility nothing like the house that now felt like a tomb of false memories. I unpacked just enough to find a business suit, the sharp black one that made me feel powerful and prepared for the afternoon's confrontation. By 2 o'clock, I was back at the house, sitting in a folding chair I'd brought specifically for this moment. The house was completely empty except for Mark's scattered belongings. The walls showed pale rectangles where pictures had hung. The floors bore indentations from furniture now gone. Sunlight streamed through bare windows, highlighting dust motes floating in the air. I positioned myself in the living room where I could see the driveway through the window. My phone, ready to record the cameras, silently capturing everything. At 3:15, Mark's silver SUV finally pulled into the driveway. I watched through the window as he got out first, stretching from the drive, then hurried around to open Jennifer's door with a gallantry he hadn't shown me in years. She stepped out wearing a sundress and sandals, her hair lighter than before, probably freshly highlighted in Miami. Robert and Linda emerged from the back seat, looking around at the neighborhood with obvious approval. Sophia, who looked about 14, was the last out earbuds in seemingly disconnected from the adult drama around her. Mark popped the trunk and they began unloading luggage. So much luggage. Jennifer had 2 large suitcases and a carry-on her parents had their own set, and Sophia dragged a pink roller bag behind her. Mark grabbed the largest suitcases, leading the group toward the front door like a hotel bellhop. I heard Jennifer's voice carrying through the window, telling Sophia she could pick any bedroom she wanted, except the master, of course. That would be for her and Mark. The key turned in the lock, and the door swung open. I wish I could have frozen that moment, the exact second when Mark's expression changed from confident satisfaction to complete confusion. He stood in the doorway, mouth open, looking at the empty foyer where our entrance table used to sit. Jennifer, peering around him, let out a shriek that probably echoed through the neighborhood. "Where's all the furniture?" she demanded, pushing past Mark into the barren house. Robert and Linda followed, their faces shifting from anticipation to bewilderment. They turned in circles, looking at the empty rooms, the bare walls, the absolute nothingness where a home should be. Sophia, suddenly interested, pulled out her earbuds and asked if they were at the right house. Mark hadn't moved from the doorway, his face cycling through emotions like a broken slot machine. Confusion, anger, fear, and back to confusion. That's when I stood up from my folding chair and walked into view. The click of my heels on the hardwood floor sounded like gunshots in the empty space. Mark's face went white when he saw me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Jennifer grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. The parents stepped back, clearly sensing something was very wrong. Sophia looked between the adults, probably wishing she'd kept her earbuds in. Mark started to speak, trying to introduce Jennifer as a colleague who needed emergency housing. The words tumbled out of him, practiced lies that sounded ridiculous in the echo of the empty house. I held up my hand, stopping him mid-sentence, and turned to Jennifer instead. I addressed her directly, my voice calm and steady, the way I talked to difficult customers who tried to scam my boutique. I told her I knew everything. 8 months of emails, credit card records, the tennis bracelet on her wrist that my household money had purchased. I pulled out my phone and showed them the screenshots Tom had sent. Mark and Jennifer on the beach at the restaurant. Jennifer showing off her engagement ring to strangers while Mark was still married to me. Jennifer's face crumbled, her hand unconsciously covering the bracelet. Her parents demanded to know what was happening, their voices rising with each question. The truth came out in pieces, like glass, shattering in slow motion. Jennifer had told her parents that Mark and I had been divorced for 6 months. She'd said I'd abandoned him, moved back to California to be with someone else, left him heartbroken and alone. They thought they were coming to help their daughter support a man who'd been wronged by his ex-wife. Linda actually gasped when she learned we were still married, that I was standing right there, that her daughter had been having an affair with a married man. Robert's face turned red, then purple, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Sophia. Poor Sophia started crying when she realized what was happening. Through her tears, she said Jennifer had told her the house's previous owner had died. That's why they were moving in to take care of it. Jennifer had actually told her daughter that I was dead. The teenager looked at me with horror and sympathy, probably wondering what else her mother had lied about. The weight of Jennifer's deceptions was crushing her own family, and I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Mark found his voice, then switching from confusion to anger. He demanded to know where the furniture was, what I'd done with our things. How dare I empty our house without consulting him? Our house, he kept saying, emphasis on the hour. That's when I dropped the next bomb. I informed him still in that deadly calm voice that the house had been sold. The closing was in 45 minutes, and the new owners would be here soon for their final walkthrough. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face went from white to red to purple, matching Robert's earlier transformation. He screamed that I couldn't sell the house without him, that it was illegal, that he'd sue me for everything I had. Jennifer joined in, screeching about community property and marital assets. That's when Diane stepped out from the garage where she'd been waiting, her presence commanding immediate attention. Diane introduced herself as my attorney and served Mark with the divorce papers right there in the empty living room. She explained in her crisp, professional tone that the house sale was completely legal given the evidence of financial fraud and the fact that my inheritance had provided the majority of the down payment. She showed him copies of his own emails discussing taking the house, the $40,000 he'd stolen from our savings, the credit card fraud for personal expenses with Jennifer. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of his protests. Jennifer turned on Mark, then the unity of their little family vacation crumbling. She screamed that he'd promised her the house was his, that she'd quit her job because he said he was getting promoted to senior vice president, that she'd pulled Sophia out of school for this move. Mark tried to calm her, but Jennifer was beyond consolation. She revealed she'd given up her apartment, sold her furniture, burned every bridge, believing in Mark's promises. The parents looked disgusted, not at me, but at their daughter and the man she'd chosen. Robert spoke up, then his voice rough with anger and disappointment. He told Jennifer they were leaving immediately, that they wanted no part of this disaster. Linda was already on her phone booking flights back to wherever they'd come from. They apologized to me, these strangers who'd been dragged into Mark's web of lies. Robert actually shook my hand, saying no one deserved what Mark and Jennifer had done. Sophia hugged me, this child I'd never met, whispering that she was sorry her mum had been so horrible. Mark's phone rang then, cutting through the chaos. He looked at the screen and his face went even paler, if that was possible. It was Richard, his CEO. Mark answered with a shaking hand, and even from where I stood, I could hear Richard's voice, cold and furious. The company had received copies of the emails, the evidence of Mark using company funds for personal trips, charging Jennifer's expenses as business costs. Mark was terminated effective immediately. His company accounts frozen, his keycard deactivated. The dominoes kept falling. Jennifer, realizing the full scope of the disaster, grabbed her suitcase and headed for the door. She told Mark he'd ruined her life, that she never wanted to see him again, that this was all his fault for lying to her about the divorce. Mark called after her, begging her to wait, but she was already getting into an Uber with her parents and daughter, leaving him standing in the empty house with his luggage scattered around him like debris after a storm. The new house buyers arrived, then the young couple excited about their future in what had been my past. They looked confused at the scene, Mark surrounded by suitcases in the empty house, Diane and I standing calmly to the side. I explained that the previous occupant was just leaving, gesturing to Mark like he was an unfortunate piece of furniture that hadn't been removed yet. The wife asked about the garden layout, and I handed her the detailed plans I'd drawn up, telling her which perennials would bloom when how to care for the roses I'd planted. Mark had no choice but to leave. He loaded his suitcases back into his SUV, his hands shaking as he struggled with the weight. His phone kept ringing with calls he didn't answer, probably credit card companies, since Diane had informed them of the pending divorce and suspicious charges. His final words to me were threats about lawyers and lawsuits, but they sounded hollow in the empty house that was no longer ours. I told him his belongings would be in storage, paid for 1 month, and after that they'd be disposed of. The key would be with Diane's office. The fallout was swift and complete. As Mark drove away, his phone lit up with message after message. His family was reaching out, having received an email from Diane with the basic facts of the situation. His mother, Margaret, called me within an hour, devastated and apologetic. She'd had no idea about Jennifer, thought Mark was in Miami for legitimate business. His father was furious not at me, but at Mark for destroying a good marriage and humiliating the family. His sister, Sarah, sent me a long text saying she'd suspected something was off but hadn't known how to tell me. My new apartment felt like a sanctuary that evening. Lauren arrived with champagne and our close friends women who'd supported my business and now rallied around me in my personal crisis. We toasted to new beginnings while I showed them around the space that was entirely mine. No memories of Mark haunted these rooms, no ghost of betrayal lingered in the corners. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt genuinely happy. The next morning, I threw myself into my boutique business. The drama had actually driven sales up as customers who'd heard through the grapevine what happened wanted to support me. Orders poured in, and I hired 2 part-time employees to help with fulfillment. The work was therapeutic, building something positive, while my old life dismantled itself through lawyers and paperwork. Each successful sale felt like a small victory, proof that I could thrive on my own. 2 weeks later, Mark tried to contact me through his lawyer. He was living in a studio apartment on the outskirts of Denver, his assets frozen pending the divorce settlement. He wanted to negotiate to work something out, claiming Jennifer had manipulated him. His lawyer presented it as a midlife crisis, a temporary insanity that shouldn't destroy 12 years of marriage. Diane laughed when she read the proposal, pointing out that 8 months of deliberate deception wasn't temporary anything. Jennifer, I learned through the inevitable grapevine, had moved back in with her parents temporarily. She'd tried to get her job back, but the position had been filled. Word had gotten around the Denver business community about her affair with a married executive, and doors that might have opened remained firmly shut. Someone told me she'd started dating again almost immediately, posting on social media about new beginnings and learning from mistakes. Sophia had returned to her old school, probably grateful to be away from the drama her mother had created. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. Thanks to Diane's excellent work and the mountain of evidence, I received 60% of the remaining marital assets, plus the full proceeds from the house sale. Mark had to pay alimony for 3 years, though it wasn't much given his current unemployment. He'd found contract work, but nothing close to his previous salary. The last I heard, he was still in that studio apartment, trying to rebuild his career and reputation. The strangest encounter came 8 months after that day in the empty house. I was at a coffee shop downtown, reviewing designs for my boutique's new physical showroom, when someone approached my table. It was Jennifer's mother, Linda. She asked if she could sit, and something in her expression made me nod. She apologized again for that day, for what her daughter had done for believing the lies. Then she told me that Jennifer was engaged again to someone she'd met online, and the family was worried she hadn't learned anything from the experience. Linda said something that stayed with me. She said that in trying to steal my life, Jennifer had lost her own while I had been freed to build something better. She was right. My boutique had grown into a recognized brand. I'd hired 5 full-time employees, and the showroom opening was scheduled for next month. I'd joined a hiking club where I met incredible people who shared my values. I'd traveled solo to Europe that trip Mark had promised, but never delivered, and discovered I was excellent company for myself. A year after the divorce, I met Daniel at that same coffee shop. He was a financial advisor who specialized in helping small business owners, and a friend had recommended him for my expanding boutique. Our first meeting was strictly professional, but his warmth and genuine interest in my business vision led to coffee dates that had nothing to do with finances. Daniel was divorced too, understood the journey of rebuilding trust, and never rushed anything between us. What struck me most about Daniel was how he celebrated my independence, rather than trying to merge our lives immediately. He had his own apartment, his own interests, his own friends, and he encouraged me to maintain mine. When he attended my showroom opening, he stood in the crowd rather than beside me, understanding this was my moment, my achievement. Later that night, he told me how proud he was not of being with me, but of knowing me. I bought a townhouse a year and a half after the divorce, smaller than the old house, but perfect for my needs. This time I chose everything myself, from the neighborhood to the paint colors to the garden design. The spare bedroom became my dream art studio, with north-facing windows and built-in storage for supplies. The garden was smaller, but entirely mine, filled with plants I chose, arranged how I wanted them. No one else's name appeared on the deed. The most meaningful work came from volunteering at a women's shelter, sharing my story with others who'd experienced betrayal and financial abuse. I helped women understand their rights, connect with lawyers, find resources for rebuilding. Many had stories worse than mine had lost, more had children to protect. Yet every woman who left that shelter did so with more knowledge and strength than when she'd arrived. We created a network of survivors who became thrivers. Mark tried to reconnect once, 2 years after the divorce. He sent a letter through Diane's office saying he'd been in therapy, had realized his mistakes, wanted to apologize properly. The letter was well written, probably coached by his therapist, hitting all the right notes about accountability and growth. I read it once, felt nothing, and filed it away. His journey toward redemption was his to travel. I had no obligation to participate in his healing at the expense of my own peace. The truth about trust is that once broken, it changes shape forever. You can build new trust with new people, but it's different, more conscious, more careful. I trusted Daniel, but with awareness. I trusted my employees, but with boundaries. I trusted myself most of all, having learned that my instincts had tried to warn me about Mark, long before my conscious mind accepted the truth. Those mornings when something felt off, those moments when his stories didn't quite align, my gut had known. 3 years after that empty house confrontation, my life looked nothing like I'd imagined it would. The boutique had 3 locations, 20 employees, and a sustainable fashion line that had been featured in major magazines. Daniel and I had moved in together, but we maintained separate bank accounts and clear financial boundaries. We talked about marriage sometimes, but neither of us was in a rush. We'd both learned that legal documents didn't guarantee loyalty or love. The old house drove by it, once curious about what the new owners had done with it. The garden was different, but beautiful. The windows had new curtains, and children's toys dotted the yard. The white picket fence had been painted blue, and someone had added a swing to the oak tree in front. It looked happy, lived in, loved. I felt no nostalgia, no regret, no wish to go back. That house had been a stage for a performance I'd believed was real. My life now was authentic, messy sometimes, but genuinely mine. Jennifer and Mark never reconnected as far as I knew. She married that man she'd met online, moved to Phoenix, started over again. Mark remained in Denver, slowly rebuilding his career, dating occasionally according to mutual acquaintances who thought I'd want to know. I didn't track either of them, didn't social media stalk, didn't care about their trajectories. They'd been major characters in one chapter of my life. But that book was closed, and I was writing a completely different story now. The deepest lesson came slowly revealed through therapy and time. Mark's betrayal had devastated me, but it had also freed me from a life where I was shrinking myself to fit someone else's vision. I'd been so focused on being the perfect wife, supporting his career, making our house a home, that I'd forgotten to ask if that life was making me happy. The affair was horrible, but the wake-up call was necessary. I'd been sleeping through my own life, and pain had been the alarm clock. Looking back now, 5 years after that afternoon in the empty house, I can see the whole journey with clarity. The pain has faded to a distant ache, like remembering a broken bone that has long since healed. The anger dissolved into understanding, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance that people show you who they are through their actions, not their words. Mark had shown me who he was, and I'd finally believed him. My business continues to thrive, built on the principle that quality and integrity matter more than quick profits or flashy marketing. Every piece we sell comes with the story of its maker, the truth of its materials, the promise of its durability. No false advertising, no hidden flaws, no promises we can't keep. The boutique's success feels like poetic justice, my little online shop that Mark had dismissed, now generating more revenue than he'd ever earned in his corporate position. Daniel and I married last spring, a small ceremony in the mountains with just family and close friends. We wrote our own vows, and mine included a promise to maintain my independence within our union. His included a promise to celebrate my success without trying to claim credit for it. We both wore wedding bands we'd designed together, but purchased separately a symbol of our commitment to partnership without codependence. The reception was in my boutique's flagship store, surrounded by the business I'd built from heartbreak into triumph. The night before the wedding, Lauren and I sat on the balcony of the mountain lodge, drinking wine and talking about the journey. She reminded me of that night in the empty house, eating takeout on the floor when I couldn't imagine feeling whole again. Now here I was, not just whole, but expanded. Not just healed, but stronger. Not just surviving, but genuinely thriving. We toasted to the women we'd become through the fires we'd survived. I still volunteer at the women's shelter now, serving on their board of directors. Last month, a woman arrived with a story eerily similar to mine. Her husband had been planning to move his girlfriend into their home, had secretly depleted their saving, had told everyone she was mentally unstable, to preemptively discredit anything she might say. I sat with her for hours, showing her my own documents from years ago, proving that survival was possible, that rebuilding was achievable, that today's ending could be tomorrow's beginning. The secret about betrayal recovery that no one tells you is that gratitude eventually arrives. Not gratitude for the betrayal itself, but for the person you become in response to it. I would never thank Mark for his affair, but I'm grateful for the strength I found, the business I built, the authentic life I created. Without that earthquake, I might have stayed in a mediocre marriage, running a small online shop, tending a garden for someone who didn't appreciate it, cooking dinners for a man who was thinking of someone else. My grandmother, whose inheritance bought that first house, used to say that money was just stored energy, waiting to create something meaningful. She would have hated what Mark did, but she would have loved what I built from the ashes. The townhouse I bought myself, the business that employs 20 people, the shelter that uses our donations to help other women escape bad situations. Her money didn't just buy property, it bought my freedom. And I've used that freedom to create ripples that extend far beyond my own life. Sometimes young women come into my boutiques bright-eyed and talking about their engagements, their wedding plans, their future homes with their partners. I don't warn them about potential betrayals or tell them to keep their finances separate or suggest prenuptials. Instead, I tell them to build something of their own, something that belongs only to them, whether it's a career, a skill, a savings account, or a dream. Not because their partner will definitely betray them, but because a person who stands on their own feet can better choose who stands beside them. The truth about that day in the empty house is that it wasn't really about Mark or Jennifer or the building itself. It was about reclaiming my power, refusing to be a supporting character in my own life story. When Mark walked into that empty house, expecting to find me prepared to host his mistress and her family, he found instead a woman who had already moved on, literally and figuratively. The house was empty because I had taken everything that mattered, left everything that didn't, and started fresh. If you're watching this wondering if you could ever recover from a similar betrayal, let me be clear. The path isn't easy, and there are days when the pain feels insurmountable. But every step forward, even the tiny ones, leads somewhere better than where you were. The betrayal feels like death, because it is the death of one version of your life. But death in nature leads to new growth, and the same is true for our lives. The person I am today couldn't exist if the person I was then hadn't been brave enough to sell that house pack. Those boxes, sign those papers, and walk into uncertainty. The last thing I'll say is this. That house I sold wasn't just walls and a roof. It was a symbol of every compromise I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, every piece of myself I'd made smaller to fit into someone else's vision. The home I've built now within myself and in my physical space is something no one can ever take away. It's built on the foundation of self-respect, decorated with authentic choices, and inhabited by a woman who knows her worth. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. When life offers you a chance to rebuild from scratch, take it with both hands. And remember, you're never too invested, too committed, or too deep into any situation to choose yourself. The price of starting over is always less than the cost of staying in a life that's slowly killing your spirit. What would you do if you discovered your partner had been planning to replace you in your own home? Have you ever had to rebuild from complete betrayal? I'd love to hear your stories of survival and triumph in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories of women who refused to be victims. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that starting over is possible, that betrayal doesn't define your ending, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Thank you for watching. And remember, your worth isn't determined by who stays or leaves, but by who you choose to become in response.